Hello again. Welcome to our lecture on compensating wage differentials. This is part one. So we know the labor market just it's not characterized by a single wage. Workers differ and jobs. Adam Smith actually, back in his day, proposed the idea that job characteristics also influence the labor market equilibrium. It's not just the wage that people care about. Compensating wage differentials, the topic of this chapter, can arise to compensate workers for non-wage characteristics of the job. We'll be focused today on looking at safety as an example, but there could be many other non-wage characteristics of a job. Could be a clean environment, friendly environment. There's lots of things that could differ between jobs, even though the nature of the job itself is the same, but the things surrounding it could be different. And these things, as we'll see, could generate wage differences. Okay, workers do have different preferences and firms offer different working conditions. Let's first just start out again with the theory of why we would expect the wage to be equalized across markets for a homogeneous type of labor. And we sort of looked at this before. In this example, we have two markets, a submarket A, submarket B. Okay, we're talking about the same kind of homogeneous labor. Now suppose in this market the wage is $10 and in the other market it's $5. And there's no, think of a competitive market, there's no frictions, there's no restrictions on people moving between markets. And so would we expect these wage differences to persist? No, and we know why, and that's because what will happen is these workers will want the higher wage, and that will reduce the supply in submarket B and increase the supply in submarket A until the wages are equalized. So jobs and workers are homogeneous and there's perfect mobility, perfect information, no cost to moving, etc. We would expect the wage structure to not have any variation. There would only be one wage rate in the economy for this type of labor. However, workers, of course, are not homogeneous. There's lots of differences between workers, there's lots of differences between jobs, and there's clearly a lot of variation in wages in the economy, even within similar occupations. Wage differentials tend to arise because of heterogeneity in jobs and workers' preferences, as we'll see, and that's what this model is about. So this model is going to explore differences in job amenities on the determination of wages and employment. So the starting point for understanding why there's a great amount of variation in wages. This model is a starting point for helping us understand that. And this is an idea, again, that we heard of from Adam Smith. He says basically that it's not really the wage that equates across markets, it's the whole of the advantages and disadvantages of the job. So a more broader picture. So more formally, workers differ in their preferences for job characteristics and firms differ in the working conditions they offer. The theory of compensating differentials tells a story of how workers and firms match and mate in the labor market. Let's suppose we have an employer X who pays $100 per hour and the workplace is clean and it's relatively safe. Another employer also pays $100 per hour, but the working conditions in this factory are much worse. It's dirty, it's noisy. So obviously most workers would undoubtedly prefer employer X. So could we have an equilibrium, competitive equilibrium, where the wage here remains? So employer Y pays 100 and employer X pays 100. So that is not going to be true because all of the workers would rather work in employer X firm, and so they would even probably be willing to take some people would be willing to take less than $100 to work at employer X. So this extra wage, so essentially in order for things to be stable here and be in an equilibrium, employer Y would have to pay more than employer X. And that's basically what a compensating wage differential is. It's the extra wage that, in this example, employer Y would have to pay to attract workers. So that's called the compensating wage differentials. And these are needed to compensate the workers for undesirable working conditions. So if there was an increase in the wage of employer Y, and if both firms could obtain the quantity and quality of workers they wanted, the wage differential would be an equilibrium differential, in the sense that there'd be no forces here causing anything to change. So employer Y would have to increase the wage such that they get the workers they require, and there's no tendency for workers between the two firms to want to move. So what are some of the assumptions in our model? So we're going to assume perfect competition. So we're going to assume firms operate at zero economic profits. There's free entry and exit. So above normal profits will attract entrants, and hence they won't have those normal profits for long. Firms compete for workers by offering different job packages, wage, and safety level. So our non-wage characteristic that we're going to be looking at is safety. It's presumably costly to reduce the risk of injury facing employees. And employers will be different in terms of the cost related to increasing safety. So they have different technology related to being able to provide safety. If a firm undertakes a program to reduce the risk of injury, for example, then it must reduce wages to remain competitive. So that's a result of our assumption of perfect competition. So forces on the employer side of the market tend to cause low risk to be associated with low wages, and high risk to be associated with high wages, holding other things constant. So we're going to represent firms with an isoprofit schedule, or curve we can call it. All this is a curve. So we'll draw it as a concave curve, and every point on it represents combinations of wages and safety that the firm can provide and maintain the same level of profit. Okay, so with each one of these things, there's a certain level of profit. We're going to assume they exhibit a diminishing marginal rate of transformation between wages and safety, and lower curves imply higher levels of profit. Let's look at these things. So the isoprofit curves look like this in the wage and safety space. I think in the textbook, in the Borjas textbook, they use risk here, so they're going to look a bit different. I'm using the exposition from the Benjamin textbook, and I've also provided that for you, so you can read through that chapter. I believe it's chapter 8, and it has these, it uses this space, wage and safety, to present this material. So these are different isoprofit curves. So as you move outwards, you're paying a higher wage and providing more safety. So it must be that as these curves move outwards, you get a lower profit. So the higher the isoprofit curves, the lower is profit. So here we have firm A. It's providing little safety and can provide additional safety in a relatively inexpensive manner, because if we look, if it wants to provide a little bit of safety, a little extra safety, it would only need to reduce the wage a little bit to have the profit remain the same. But we're assuming that there's diminishing marginal returns to safety expenditures. So you could think of here, it might be just easy to clean up the factory, move things around. It's not too expensive to increase safety when safety is very low. But if you wanted to, say, prevent people from getting any illnesses or a cold, then you would have to install very expensive equipment. So for greater and greater levels of safety, the firm would require, would have to pay a much lower wage in order to keep their profits the same. So if we wanted to increase safety here at point B, you can see to keep profits the same, the wage would have to fall by a lot more than for the same change in safety here. So both wages and safety are costly for the firm, and a firm can maintain profit and increase safely only if it can pay a lower wage. That is, since these are downward sloping, that's the consequence of them being downward sloping, is that this assumption is what is made. So profit, as I said, increases as you move inward, not outward, as you may think. But if you think about it, as you move outward, wages and safety, which are expenses to the firm, are higher, and we're assuming everything else is constant, so profit, of course, is going to be lower as you move out, but as you move in, it's going to be higher. Okay, so different firms can have different safety technologies. So for example, firm 1 here wouldn't even be able to provide safety levels above this point, but firm 2 can. So they have different abilities to provide safety at a given cost. Hence, there are different isoprofit curves for the same level of profit for different firms. So both of these firms can have zero profits, but the curves are going to be different because they have different technology. The outer edge is what we call the employer's offer curve or market envelope. So if you think about it, these are the only feasible wage risk combinations that would be offered in the market. No one would accept a wage lower than what could be here for a given level of safety. So we have firms, they're represented by isoprofit curves, and workers have iso-utility or indifference curves. And we're familiar with these. These will show in this case the level of safety and wage that yield the same level of utility. We are going to assume that workers have different risk preferences. They may be willing to give up safety for a compensating risk premium. And there's a diminishing marginal rate of substitution between wages and safety. Let's look at a single individual. So on their indifference curve, we have 2 points, A and B. And so we're saying that this person is indifferent between having little safety but this higher wage, or a lower wage but this much safety. And higher indifference curves mean the person is happier. Now, let's look over here to the right. If we have two individuals, we have one with an indifference curve UB, another steeper indifference curve UA. So what do these different indifference curves say about the preferences of these two individuals? Well, the first one, this person represented by indifference curve A, is less risk averse. Okay, so if you reduce safety from S0 to S1 for this person, you would have to, they would need a higher wage to remain indifferent compared to person B. So B would only need this, whereas the other person would need this entire amount. So this person UA, who is more risk adverse, if you take away this amount of safety, they need a higher wage to keep them equally happy. But the other person who's less risk averse, the flatter curve, only needs this much of a wage. Okay, so steep indifference curves mean people are more risk adverse, they don't like risk, and people with flatter curves are less risk adverse. They don't mind, for example, enduring more unsafe conditions if they can get a higher wage for that. So our assumptions for the preferences are that the individuals want to maximize their utility. And it's important to point out they're maximizing their utility, not their income. So compensating wage differentials will arise only if some people do not choose the highest paying jobs offered, preferring instead a lower paying but more pleasant job. So, you have to have some heterogeneity. Wages do not equalize in this case. The net advantage, as we remember what Smith said earlier in an earlier slide, it's the overall, the net advantage, the overall utility from the pay and the psychic or non-wage aspects of the jobs. Those are what tend to equalize for marginal workers. And in that case, then, we will have different wages, even for the same, jobs. Assumption 2, worker information. We're going to assume that the workers know about job characteristics of potential importance to them. Therefore, employers offering hazardous working conditions with no compensating wage differentials would not be able to recruit and retrain workers. So the employers can't trick workers. We're assuming there's perfect information. They know enough information to evaluate the situation. We could think of this as coming from word of mouth or direct observations or former employees. We will relax this assumption later and see what it implies. Assumption 3, workers are mobile. So workers can be mobile because they have a range of job offers from which to choose. There will be no compensating wage differentials if only the dangerous jobs were available to workers. And it is the act of choosing safe jobs over dangerous jobs that forces employers offering dangerous work to raise wages. Okay, so let's look at a single firm and a single individual with this model. So we have an isoprofit curve. Okay, we're going to say that there's perfect competition, so this firm is making 0 profits. So profit equals 0. Now workers are going to choose jobs that yield the highest utility, which is given by the tangency at EC. So we're going to pull that out till we get tangent to the isoprofit curve, and that's going to be our equilibrium. Okay, so this worker would work at this firm for a wage of WC and a safety level of SC. So individuals will sort themselves into firms of different risks, and they will receive compensating wages because there's going to be a non-random sorting of workers and firms. Workers are going to self-select themselves across the spectrum of firms. Some will like a higher wage and more risk. Some are very risk adverse, etc. And so the tangencies of all those will be called the wage safety locus, which will be the various wages and safety combinations that will actually be observed in the market. Okay, so here's an example. So we know that only the outer portion of these curves will be relevant here. This is the employer's offer curve, and we'll have some heterogeneity in workers. They'll have different indifference curves, and they will be tangent at different points. And so our wage safety locus is just the slope of the line that runs through these tangency points. And so this will tell us the trade-off between wages and safety in the market. The slope will be negative because compensating wages are required for reductions in safety. The magnitude will be determined by workers' preferences and firm technology for safety, because that will determine the shapes of those different isoprofit and indifference curves. So holding worker characteristics constant, so example, skill level, age, experience, race, gender, any other determinants of wages constant, the simple theory leads to the prediction that compensating wage differentials will be associated with various job characteristics. So positive differentials or higher wages will accompany bad job characteristics like risk of injury, while negative differentials, lower wages, will be associated with good ones. So we should see that the wage at bad jobs is greater than the wage in good jobs. So we've introduced the model. Let's stop there and do some practice problems. Suppose all workers have the same preferences represented by this indifference curve. So this is the square root of W minus 2x. And x is the proportion of the firm's air that is composed of toxic pollutants. Let's assume there's only two types of jobs, a clean job and a dirty job. A clean job is when x is equal to 0, and a dirty job is when it's equal to 1. And of course we see if it's 1, we'll be subtracting away from utility. Now let W0 be the wage paid by the clean job, and W1 be the wage paid by the polluted job. If the clean job pays $16 per hour, what is the wage in the dirty job? And the other question is, what is the compensating wage differential? So let's think about this. Well, we know that the worker's utility from the clean job will be U0 equals square root of 16 equals 4. We're just plugging in the wage into the indifference function, and we know x is equal to 0, so that term is gone. Okay, so their utility will be 4. So in the market equilibrium, the utility obtained from the clean job and the dirty job should be the same. Thus, the wage in the dirty job will be easily obtained by setting the indifference or utility function equal to 4, but then putting our x equals 1 in, so then we have that negative 2, and solving for the wage. We're going to find the wage that would make the utility the same as if the person was in the clean job. Okay, so when we solve for this, we get that W1 should be $36. So the wage for the dirty job should be 36 in the equilibrium, and so the compensating wage differential would be the difference. It would be equal to 20. Now consider the diagram for a labor market in which the relative job attribute is job safety. So that's what we've been looking at. Why are the isoprofit curves concave? Why did we say they were concave? Well, the reason why we said they're concave is that there is a diminishing returns to safety technology. So when a firm increases safety, it becomes more and more expensive as they do so. So the answer is E, because it becomes more and more costly for the employer to make the workplace progressively safer. Next question. Fill in the blank of the following sentence. The isoprofit schedule exhibits something blank between wages and job safety levels. So is it an increasing marginal rate of transformation, a diminishing marginal rate of transformation, a diminishing marginal rate of substitution, or an increasing marginal rate of substitution, or a constant trade-off? Well, we know it's B, it's the diminishing marginal rate of transformation. The employer's offer curve, so that outer envelope that we remember seeing, what does it show? Does it show the maximum compensating wages that will be offered in the labor market for various levels of safety? Does it show the minimum compensating wages, wage levels offered by employers that are dependent on the required levels of health and safety, or the employer's preferred combination of wage and safety? So the answer is A. It's showing the maximum compensating wages that would be offered in the market for various levels of safety. Next question. The curvature of the ISO utility curve illustrates what? Remember what the indifference curve looks like? Why does it look that way? Well, A is a diminishing marginal rate of transformation between wages and job safety, a diminishing marginal rate of substitution between wages and job safety, the diminishing marginal rate of technical substitution, the amount of safety that can be exchanged for wages, and E, the law of diminishing returns applies to wages. So the answer is actually C. The diminishing marginal rate of technical substitution between wages and job safety. So that's what we call the so that you have the marginal rate of technical substitution is the slope of lines tangent to the indifference curve, and we have that those slopes fall. Okay, we have a question here where we have a diagram of one isoprofit curve and two indifference curves, and we know the optimum point for the individual is at point A. And so it's asking us which point in the diagram refers to a situation where the worker, represented by the depicted indifference curves, is worse off due to improved safety at the expense of a lower wage. Okay, well, if nothing was in, there was no abstraction, there was no, frictions of, this person was allowed to choose what they wanted to, they would want to be at point A and get a utility associated with U2. Now, if they're forced to take a higher level of safety at the expense of a lower wage, they're going to be over to the right here, so higher levels of safety and then a lower wage. So, but it has to be still on the isoprofit curve. So this would be the point here that we would be talking about. So the answer would be C, higher safety, lower wage, but the person is on a lower indifference curve. So they have a lower level of utility at this point than if they were at their optimum point. So of course, they're working in a much safer environment, so they get some extra utility for that. But the disutility from this much lower wage outweighs that, and they have a lower level of satisfaction overall. Okay, so now we have a diagram with three different isoprofit curves. So we got different technologies for different firms, and the question is saying which one of the following wage and safety combinations would never be accepted by workers. Okay, so would this point be accepted by workers? Well, yep, some could have indifference curves that would be tangent here. What about this point? Yes, we could have indifference curves here. We could have one touching here, but we're asked again, which one of the following wage and safety combinations would never be accepted by workers? Well, the answer is W3 and S2. And that's because workers would never accept this lower, they could always get a higher wage, say up here, than that. So this firm 1 here, would be willing to offer this worker this higher wage for this level of safety. So this firm is never going to get a worker to work at a wage of W3 and get S2. And then we also have a similar logic for W1 and S0, but it wasn't listed here. Okay, consider the following diagram. It shows two individual preferences for wages and safety. Which of the following statements is true? So person 1 is risk adverse because she requires a lower wage increase to compensate for a reduction in safety compared to person 1. Well, let's look at this. So let's think about a reduction in safety. So this person doesn't need much of an increase in wage to keep them equally well off compared to this person. This person, you take a little bit of safety away, the wage increase is going to be always higher than this person to keep them equally, to keep their utility, or to keep them indifferent. So we know then that this indifference curve that's flat is for someone that's less risk adverse. This person is very risk averse. Okay, so person 1 is risk averse, so that's true because she requires a lower wage increase to compensate for a reduction in safety compared to person 1. Well, we are talking about person one. B, person one is risk averse because she requires a higher wage increase to compensate for a reduction in safety compared to person two. That sounds right. Person two is risk adverse. Nope. So we know that the answer must be B. Okay, well, thank you for listening. This is the end of our first part on compensating wage differentials. Next class, we will continue our discussion. Have a great day. Thank you very much. Bye.